Good morning, everyone. Welcome. When I looked at, I went over to Kane's speaker profile on the app to see if I can get information about him and his background and some anecdotes I can share with you. And of course, there's nothing there. It's like corporate security engineer. Like even his photos. If you look at if you meet the other security team people, you'll notice they have like no photos on there at all. It's like they have the egg. So I don't know much about Kane because he's just he's very enigmatic, and I'm hoping that he can share some stuff with us that you guys can learn about securing apps in the cloud. That's a big theme that we have: security, and helping our vendors be, like we talked about, the vendor incident management response and security guidelines, privacy guidelines. But it's really nice to have some practitioner advice to the crowd. So everyone, welcome Kane.
Hey. Thanks for the intro, Neil. I've got a bad case of speaker voice at the moment, so if I do, start crackling up after 20 minutes, Neil's going to have to fill in and do some stand-up or something. Okay, so let's get going. So before we start, let's do an exercise. Has anyone found a critical security bug in their software? Definitely here. Has anyone had to fill in one of those awful questionnaires for a customer? Yeah. Has anyone actually experienced a security incident? Okay, so fewer numbers there. So a little bit of background. You probably all know this anyway, but let's go over it. So P2, generally a jar file you install in your server instance. Connect is a little bit less tangible than that, so it's more like connecting via the APIs to your cloud infrastructure. So I want you to take off your developer hat for a little while and put on like a sysadmin hat. And not just any sysadmin, like a very security conscious person. So let's think like you work for a bank or AWS or something like that. So imagine that you're like a sysadmin for maybe 1,000+ people. So let's look at P2. And P2, usually behind the firewall, because it's a server instance. It's auditable, so your code, I can take it, I can reverse it, I can look at what it does if I was, so inclined. And you can do change management on it, so it's like a tangible thing. Like I can choose to install that P2 plugin. And Connect, it's a little bit different. So obviously, I can go to the marketplace and I can see like what your app does. But does it do anything else that maybe you haven't told me? What do you do with your data as well? So like, do you share it with third parties? Do you maybe send it to a basement somewhere on some random server? And ultimately, you end up like relying on trust and not security. So the idea is that I can't really trust in, I can't know that your security is good, so I have to trust that you say like what you're doing is good. So like we had a look at Marketplace, and we looked at like what people are doing. And so let's have a look at some of the results. And here's just some aggregated results for a few of the things. I'll give you a minute to take a look. So does anything stand out? Yeah, a few, I think. Like storing encrypted was pretty small. Like maybe about 90% of apps store data. And I mean, we don't even store encrypted all the time in Atlassian, so we can't exactly tell you to do things we're not doing, but it's definitely ideal practice. Very few had certifications, so this is stuff like SOC 2, ISO, things like that. A few did, but it was pretty small, under 10%. And source code and dependency scanning. So Dan Hardiker talked about this yesterday. Like it was fairly small numbers, so under 25%. So on top of that data, I talked to a lot of you and found out like what issues you have, what security incidents we've had in the past. And kind of this talk is just like mile wide, inch deep on a couple of issues. So it's like common stuff that we've seen a lot. So first one, code security. So Dan talked about this a little bit yesterday. And it's stuff like code scanners, bug bounties, pen tests. And a lot of people say which one is best for marketplace developers, like what's best for me. So when I talk about code scanners, I'm talking about dependency scanners most of the time. Static analysis is good, but it's probably out of the reach of most marketplace vendors. So we're talking about things like SNCC.io, SourceClear, stuff that scans third-party libraries for issues. Bug bounties is getting security researchers to actually look at your code and find vulnerabilities. We use BugCrowd in Atlassian, and I recommend you do the same. And at pen tests, so this is companies that come in maybe yearly or when you're going to release a tool, and it's essentially like do code reviews. And so I would recommend out of these, like look at things like SNCC.io, look at SourceClear, and try and implement these. They're pretty cheap, they're very easy to do, and SourceClear has a free version that gives you 5 scans a month, I believe it was. So, it's not even something that you have to pay for. Bug bounties, I would say second. It's good, but definitely get the dependency stuff out the way first. Pen tests, they can be useful, especially if a customer asks for it, but it's not something I'd recommend you actively do unless you're maybe releasing a new product. So with that in mind, before you actually implement any of these tools, actually put an SDLC, and that's security, not software development lifecycle, in place, because if you go for a bug bounty without having this in place, you'll end up spending a lot of money, basically. So a bug bounty should be there to find your critical issues, your high issues, that kind of thing. You shouldn't really rely on it to find all the low issues, because like I say, you're gonna be bombarded, basically. So this is something security people always talk about, and everyone gets annoyed about it. But MFA is moving. The stuff that was good 5 years ago is not the same now. It's pretty bad, I would say, in comparison. So the first thing I want to say is this is focused on you and your security, so stuff you do. So AWS, Bitbucket, GitHub, that kind of thing. So you can recommend this stuff for your customers as well, but I would say this is more focused on you. Okay, so U2F. Has anyone heard of this? Hands up. Does anyone know why it's good? It's probably a smaller number, right? I'm going to talk about this in a minute, so I'm going to go into the other two a bit first. So essentially, before I really go into it, I have to say, so you got to put MFA on everything, basically. So who here puts MFA on AWS or Azure or their cloud infrastructure? It's a lot, right? Who does it with GitHub or Bitbucket? Smaller number? What about email? Other smaller SaaS services? It's even smaller still, right? It's probably like 20% at that point. So yeah, if I've got one piece of advice, it's put MFA on everything. People are going to attack the weak points. They're going to go after your email. Try and use that to laterally move to other things. And yeah, so here we go. So push-based and OTP, 2FA, it's pretty good. It holds up. It's easy to implement. SMS and call is basic. It doesn't hold up to targeted attacks. If anyone saw the Reddit attack this year, essentially they got in via SMS 2FA because there's so many ways of breaching it now. You can brute force the OTP codes. You can, fake a SIM card and do it that way. So it really doesn't hold up. And U2F is, like I say, one of the best, but maybe a little bit harder to implement. And this, you might want to take a picture of this. I put a bit.ly link in as well to make it a bit easier. So Google hasn't been phished since they implemented U2F. So that's really how good this is, basically. So it's definitely something I would look at for implementing for yourselves. I know we support it in Bitbucket, hopefully in Atlassian Identity, maybe in the future. And people like G Suite, Microsoft, they will support it. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about logging. So one thing to say is that if an attacker wants to hit someone like Amazon, they're not going to go directly for Amazon. They're going to go through, third parties somewhere in the supply chain. So if anyone saw a Target hack a few years ago, they didn't go for Target directly. They got in via their, heating and ventilation supplier because they still have connection to their network. And that's one thing I would say to all of you is people aren't going to go for your customers directly. They may go for you and try and use your access to go for your customers. Oh, oof. Clicker, I'll have to go back. Oh. One more. There we go. So if you went back a few years and asked security teams what you should be logging, they would probably tell you to log everything, which is pretty legit. I mean, you can't go back in time and get logs, basically, so it makes sense. But this has come up for a few problems. I mean, you just have the spoiler, so you probably saw. But yeah, essentially, people log too much sometimes. So you can log passwords, you can log JWT tokens, session tokens, all these kind of things, and it's really hard once you put logging in place to like actually find this stuff. So I would say be more targeted with your logging, and that's pretty much where things are going. So it's not you should log everything; it's that you should try and log like the most important things. You're probably asking like, what are those important things? So a few of them might be pull requests, 2FA devices being added to your accounts, new accounts being created, logins to EC2. Maybe someone's like spamming up some instances to do some crypto mining or something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about tenant separation, and that's kind of keeping data apart. So is anyone from Gliffy here? Oh, we've got a few. So I used you guys as an example. I'm not saying Gliffy have a problem with like tenant separation, but I was making one of their diagrams to do this, and so I figured that'd be a good example. So basically, tenant separation is keeping data apart. So we don't want customer X's data to, hit customer Y. We don't want them to see each other's data. And so this can cause problems if something like this happens. And we've actually seen a few incidents of this in the marketplace. We've had at least 2. So yeah, pretty much like this is an issue, and it can be caused by a bunch of things, like just issues in your code, not testing properly. And it's not something that's easy to fix either. So like you can put logging in place to find it, but really like having good change management is what's going to help you fix this. And it's a hugely complicated topic because it's really going to depend on your infrastructure, whether you're using hardware, Docker, Kubernetes, or not. So I guess most people have developed in Connect here. So most people have probably used scopes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of scopes. Here's the hierarchical scopes. So these are like the main bulk of scopes in Connect. So read, write, delete, and every one that you add gives everything below it. So if I give someone admin, then you obviously get read, write, and so on. So there's a problem with this, really, in that like you've got to think about how an attacker sees this. And so if they see read, they can siphon data. If they see write, maybe they can add data, add vulnerabilities into the page, add iframes, that kind of thing. Delete, maybe they can like delete customer data. And admin, well, it doesn't take much imagination to see what they can do there. So that would be things like removing users, adding users, and so on. And so really, these are like permissions in Android and things like that. So it's like how and what you can access. So the more scopes you put in, obviously, the more risk that you're putting on your customers. But that's something you have to manage, basically. So I've dedicated a scope just to this one, and it wasn't to scare you, but it is a little bit at the same time. So essentially, act as user, and it makes like perfect sense, this one. So the idea is that if I want to edit a page, then it says a user does it. It doesn't say that the app does it. And there's a few other use cases for it. But that does mean that the app can act on the user's behalf. It can potentially pretend to be a user. And so they could maybe do things and say it was Neil, for example, instead of actually being the app, which is obviously hard when you're logging and you're like looking for this stuff. So I'd say if I've got one piece of advice, it's to keep your scopes lean. Don't just give admin and for no reason. Like actually try and keep it small and like ask yourself if that new feature you're adding is like absolutely required. Like if there's a small thing that you're adding that requires admin and everything else you've got is read right now, question whether your customers would be like more willing to have that feature or more willing to have the security of just read. So I'm going to talk a little bit about certifications. So again, Dan talked about this in his talk yesterday. So I'm just going to go into a bit more depth. So SOC 2 and ISO are really the big 2. These are the big 2 because they're globally recognized, and pretty much like anywhere you go, people will ask for these. So in Atlassian, in order for us to do SOC 2, it was 39 requirements, and for ISO, it was 141 requirements. So you can see the size difference. So I would say, if I have to recommend one to you guys, it's SOC 2, because it's simply easier, it's quicker. And SOC 2, there's a lot of overlap with ISO. So you can do SOC 2, and then move on to ISO in the future if you want. So it's definitely a good goal to work towards. You're probably asking price, like, is it, out of bounds for me? Like, how much does it cost? So 20K US dollars is pretty much the average, but you can shop around. You can get it for about 12, especially if you do it like during the off season, because this is an annual thing for a lot of people. And maybe, like I say, if you look for cheaper things. And the idea is that, like, for Atlassian, for us to do this was really hard because we have lots of systems, we have lots of people, lots of operating systems and whatnot. If you're smaller, so say you only use Windows machines, you only use AWS, you only have like 5 SaaS tools, then this is pretty easy to do in comparison. So it doesn't take as much time, as much effort, and whatnot. And a lot of people ask, why bother with certifications? Like, what does it give me? And the idea is that customers are looking for certifications for trust in your software. So the idea is they get a third party to come in, audit you, see what you're doing, and make sure that you're doing things right. And there's tons of certifications out there. This is just a few. Like I say, SOC 2 and ISO are really the globally recognized ones, and the others maybe a bit more local. And some places require SOC 2 and ISO. So like, especially some bigger vendors that maybe work with governments and so on, like they want to see SOC 2 or ISO, like to know that all of their vendors have proper security controls in place. So I've told you some of the problems, and now I'm gonna tell you some of the things that we're like doing to help you about it, basically. So Brendan Foley mentioned a few of these things in the keynote. And the first one was vendor security guidelines. So the idea is that we want to make this as easy for you as we can, basically. So like a lot of the stuff I've just talked about today is stuff that's going to be in there. We've kind of split it into 4 sections. So we've got workstations and accounts. So like I say, dealing with MFA, password managers, encryption, patching, firewalls, that kind of thing. Infrastructure, obviously dealing with AWS, Azure. It's pretty generic, so it shouldn't matter what platform you use. So that's stuff that you would be doing on all of them anyway. Secure development, so dependencies, how you do a WASP top 10, how you look for this stuff, what kind of things you do. And the last one is policies and standards. So not just SOC 2 and ISO, but other stuff as well. So stuff like incident response plans, stuff like maybe policies and standards for like your passwords and disaster recovery, that kind of thing. And that leads me well into the next section, which is the incident response guidelines. So for people who saw Dan's talk yesterday, he had a very specific issue. He had a high CVSS scored vulnerability that he found in his code. And that's something we were able to help him with. So essentially, we wanted to make it like a bit more obvious on what you should be doing when things go wrong. So like when you should contact us, what you should do, what you should give us. And so the idea is that we were going to add in a few examples. So for example, the CVSS score one, that's a good example. Another one may be that your account has been breached and maybe someone's uploaded like a malicious version of your app to attack your customers. That's definitely something we can help with. We can, remove the app, we can get your account back and so on. Ransomware, probably can't help you with that. You probably need to keep backups. So I'm not sure that we can help you get your data back, but this is the kind of thing we'll be looking at. Essentially wrapping this up, these were the key takeaways that I really found here. So the fact that MFA isn't always used everywhere, and it really should be. Monitoring logs as well. So I know a lot of people here log, they use debug logs, info logs, whatnot, but how many people actually look at their logs? And not just grepping through their logs, but like actually alerting on them. So going through AWS, looking at and setting up alerts on certain triggers. So the idea is you don't want to be looking through your logs manually. You want to be notified when something bad goes wrong. And the last one is create policies. So the idea is that customers want to know about your security. Like they want to know about this stuff when they use your tools. So making it as easy for them to access that information as possible. So really, like this is going to be things, like I say, maybe SOC 2, maybe ISO, but not even that. It's more simple. It's privacy policy, security policy, and stuff that you probably already do now, but just making sure that those are like full of the information they need. So I went through a little bit quickly, actually. So I've actually got a few time for questions, and I've got the fire pit right after if anyone's interested. But yeah,
Awesome.
happy for questions.
Toby, of course.
Hi, thanks for this. About the Scopes and Connect apps, those are fairly wide, especially if you're looking at admin scope or act as user.
Yep.
Do you guys maybe plan on releasing like more scopes that allow ourselves to lock ourselves into the specific scopes that we actually need?
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest. I know it's something we've talked about, and I know it's something the security team have definitely asked for, was like more granular scope. So the idea is maybe that we could lock down admin to just a certain space, and maybe we only want read in the finance area, for example, something like that.
Yeah,
that would be something that's really good to have, but it's not something that's the case right now.
Space level and then project level seemed the most logical,
Yep.
right? And probably would knock down a lot of concerns that I can access everything. Yeah. But so your question was, are there any plans? I mean, I know that I've been in meetings where we've talked about these things. So I think that there are definitely interest internally to make that happen. Yeah.
Anything else?
One thing I noticed is that a lot of the hacks that we read about are always like, they're really basic attacks, right? Like it was because they got into my email. So it's never like the elaborate.
Yeah, like the
Tom
elaborate
Cruise,
ones.
like, coming down and like stealing my shit through my data center. No, it's always something as basic as like an email address. I mean, my Gmail getting hacked.
Yeah, the elaborate ones definitely happen, and like if you're going to attack, like I say, a bigger vendor, someone like Google, you're going to need to use these kind of like big, complicated attacks, stuff like container escapes and like remote code execution. But a lot of people fail because of the basic stuff, and that's why I was saying like put MFA on everything, because if you're putting MFA on your AWS infrastructure but not your GitHub account, that's kind of bad. Like they can just get access to your GitHub account, change your code, and then maybe you upload it, you don't see the pull request or something, and then they essentially have access to your stuff.
Just a quick one. Just at the end there, you kind of mentioned alerts, sort of AWS alerts on stuff you log.
Yep.
Is there any sort of security-specific alerts that you kind of recommend us look out for?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's going to depend on your infrastructure more than anything, I would say. So I kind of mentioned a few of them. So maybe like if new EC2 instances are being spun up, that would be something to look for. Definitely things like new admin accounts being created or anything happening with user accounts are pretty important things to look out for. So they were like some of the main ones I would look for. But I mean, it's going to depend on your infrastructure for a lot of the points. So like people have done very good guides on this stuff. So I would say like look into like what should I log for AWS? What should I log for Google Cloud? And people are going to have this stuff like super easily available.
Does anyone here in the room have an app or an add-on that serves a customer that is like a Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 customer? Yeah? Okay, I see some hands. So that point I think you made earlier about, like, I think when a lot of people think about security, they think about like protecting their own data, their own assets, but really it's not like your stuff that they're interested in.
Yep.
It's the customer stuff they're interested in, right? And so, I mean, I can't even imagine what would it be like if I was the vector of, all of the, huge corporation, being infiltrated through my my free app on the Atlassian marketplace as an example. Does anyone have free ones out there? Anyone? No, they're all paid. Okay.
But yeah, like I say, logging is super important for that kind of thing, because if an attacker gets into your app, it gets into your network, it gets into like your GitHub account, they're not going to make themselves known, or at least most of the time they're not. They're going to try and remain quiet and then go to your customers through that. So the idea is that you need to log in order to find this stuff, because a lot of the times they're not going to make it obvious. So like I would say that's one of the more important things to look out for.
Maybe there's a bigger sample size. So the slide that you had with all of the different like questions we asked, well, a series of vendors. Who here does like source code security scanning, like searching for vulnerabilities in your source code? Okay, so I want to make sure that was like an anomalous array. How about dependency checks? You look at the libraries you use. Same hands.
OWASP have a tool called dependency check, which is free. So, and it scans jars. So you don't even need to put it into your build pipeline. You can literally just, build your stuff, have the jar if you're running a server version, and then just scan straight from there.
Does anyone use tools to scan your services like I don't know, the one Rapids?
Yeah, Nexpose.
Yeah, I call it Nexpose because that sounds cooler. Anyone use those things, like those types of tools, or the OWASP 10? No. So I think that there's, to the point, I think to your talk, there's a lot to learn out there and obviously to apply. And I think that just the larger the customers get for you, you're going to be the attack vector, right? Because I think that they know that this is probably the easiest way to get in to steal corporate data.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you recommend any good habits or recommendations about how to keep the data separate from the different customers? So separate databases, set up base database schemes, or what are the best techniques you have seen so far?
Yeah. And like I say, it is one of those super difficult topics because it's going to really heavily depend on what you're doing. Like I say, if you're first building your app, you might put all of your data in something like an RDS or just like a single database. That's obviously meaning that all of your customer data is eventually going to flow into one point, which is difficult because unless you use shards, things like that, it's going to be a problem. Like I think the biggest place where issues of that kind come from is caching, stuff like memcache. Like that's what we see a lot of the time, like especially in other companies as well. It's when you're caching and maybe you haven't got like UUIDs for specific customers, that's when stuff can get really messy. So definitely not just your databases, but your cache data as well is like really important.
You guys hear that one? I was part of I remember actually it was part of an incident where that was exactly what happened. And so it had nothing. So their data and their code they kept everything compartmentalized and everything was tagged with an instance ID, except the way that they implemented a cache was that it just stuff was getting reused and it kind of got dirty and they lost track of that. So that can happen. Yeah.
Cool.
Any other questions? Oh, one back here.
So it's clear that a bunch of us aren't doing some of the security analysis that maybe we could be doing. Would Atlassian be able to publish or post some information somewhere to help us do those things and tackle those problems that are the kind of low-hanging fruit?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the idea of like the vendor security guidelines and the incident response guidelines. The idea is that it's going to give you like a checkbox model that you can follow to like get over the easy stuff. So like I've been working on that recently, and like I say, a lot of it was stuff I talked about today, but it's going to go in a bit more depth. So it's going to be like, here is like actually how you do these things and how you like how you implement source clear. So for example, like building it into your build pipeline and so on. So yeah, that's definitely one thing. I'd say that's probably the best thing. Like that should be out within a few weeks. So I would say definitely look at that, and that's a really good place to start. Cool.
Another thing too, I mean, if you just look at the SOC 2 guidelines and the ISO 27001 in particular, I mean, they're pretty easy to follow and they look very basic and it's all understandable. I mean, I don't know how many of you love reading ISO documents, but this one in particular, you'll understand them, right? So, I mean, that's a good place just to kind of take a look at. And then if you haven't been to Atlassian.com/trust, that's also a really good. There's a little security tab there, and you can read about the stuff that we do. That's a question
we
that we
pretty
often
much
get.
Publish everything that we do. So we publish all of our information on our bug bounty program, like what we did, how we do it, and all of that is on our Trust Center. So that's definitely a good place to go. Like if you're thinking, should I go for a bug bounty program? Like, how do I even do it? Where do I start? We've got all that information on the Trust Center.
Cool. And what time's the fire pit? Now or soon?
Yeah, about 10 minutes. So.
Okay, yeah, let's get the hell out of here and mosey on up there to get in line. Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much, Kane.
Thanks a lot.